Welcome back to the Deep Dive, Mr. A's World History students. Today we're diving deep into part 3 of the French Revolution. A revolution, a republic, and the terror. This is, well, it's a really crucial part of your unit too. Revolutions that reshaped the world. And remember, we've talked about those initial, really inspiring aspirations of the revolution, those powerful ideas like liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression.
Exactly. And that really sets up the big question for us today, the central historical question we're looking at. To what extent did these escalating internal crises and also the persistent external threats lead the French Revolution to, well, progressively abandon or compromise its founding principles? We're really going to unpack that journey, from these very high ideals to some pretty drastic measures.
That's right. We'll trace how those promises made back in those, let's say, optimistic days of 1789 were either kept or maybe bent a little or sometimes just completely broken, especially as France navigated all that chaos and conflict. It's a fascinating and honestly often brutal transformation. Okay, so to really understand how far things shifted, we need to remember their starting point, right? The incredible blueprint, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from 1789. I mean, just imagine it, the very first words declaring all men are born free and equal in rights, Article 1, and then listing these core rights, liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression, that's Article 2.
It really was monumental. And what's so interesting there, especially in Article 3, is this radical shift towards national sovereignty. It declared all authority comes directly from the nation. It actually says, no body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. I mean, think about that. That's a complete break from the divine right of kings. Just tearing down centuries of tradition saying power flows from the people, not, from God. That was absolutely earth-shattering. And then Article 6, emphasizing equality before the law, and said, all citizens, being equal in the eyes of the law, are equally eligible to all dignities and to all public positions and occupations according to their abilities, and without distinction except that of their virtues and talents. So merit, not birth.
And Article 11, calling the free communication of ideas and opinions one of the most precious of the rights of man. To actually state that back in 1789, that was an incredibly powerful, really forward-thinking vision. It sets the stage for what they thought they were building. But, even as those grand words were echoing, cracks were already starting to appear. The ink was barely dry before the tough realities of power politics started, well, testing those limits. Let's look at limited suffrage. The Assembly decided only active citizens could vote. These were men over 25 who paid a certain amount of taxes. Or what else? Passive citizens. They get civil rights, sure, but zero political participation.
Yeah, and this wasn't just some minor detail. It really exposed this deep tension, between those abstract ideals of equality and the practical reality of who actually held economic power, and therefore who they trusted to wield political influence. It shows how quickly that revolutionary fire meets the cold calculation of who gets to be in control. That journalist, Camille Desmoulins, he nailed it in his newspaper, right? Yes, but what is the much repeated word active citizens supposed to mean? The active citizens are the ones who took the Bastille, pointing out the hypocrisy right there.
Right. And then adding to the frustration, you had the king's veto power. Louis XVI got this suspensive veto, which basically meant he could delay laws for up to 6 years if the Assembly didn't pass it 3 times in a row. You can just imagine the public anger this caused. Combine that with ongoing bread shortages. Well, it led to thousands of women marching on Versailles, October 5th, 1789. Men joined them too. They actually invaded the palace, demanding Louis XVI and his family come back to Paris, which they did, escorted by, like, 60,000 people. The Assembly followed soon after. The monarchy was effectively under Parisian watch now.
And beyond the politics, you see another major compromise with religion, the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, July 1790. The Assembly declared all Catholic Church lands and property belonged to the nation, which they then sold off, to pay France's huge debts. Plus, priests and bishops were now supposed to be elected by the people, which really cut down the Pope's authority in France, making the clergy almost like state employees. This created a huge conflict. November 1790, priests had to take this oath of loyalty to the new government. About half refused. And this caused a really serious split in the French public, especially in the countryside, in rural areas where faith was strong. It definitely undermined support for the revolution. There's this drawing from 1789, you mentioned it, with the quote, "It is necessary to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to the nation what is the nation's." It forced this choice, didn't it? And that really fractured unity.
And wow. Okay, so beyond these internal struggles over who's really part of the nation, the revolution's big ideas faced an even tougher test with the colonies. Because despite all the talk of universal liberty, what happened with the exclusion of colony slavery? Well, that's something else. March 1790, the Assembly decides to exempt the colonies from the new Constitution and the rights it granted, and to make it a crime to support slave uprisings. It's a stark contradiction, isn't it? The same people proclaiming universal liberty are actively preserving slavery. What does that tell you about the edges of the revolutionary vision? But even with that official stance, some radical voices were speaking out. There was this newspaper, Révolution de Paris, saying in September 1790, "As for the slave trade and the slavery of Negroes, the European governments will find it useless to oppose the cries of philosophy and the principles of universal liberty that germinate and spread throughout nations."
Right. And this leads to a huge, maybe unintended consequence. Because even though they tried to exclude them, the ideas of equality and liberty did reach the colonies. Of course they did. And this directly fueled the major revolt of enslaved people in Saint-Domingue in August 1791. A brutal, long struggle that eventually led to Haiti's independence in 1804. So the ideals, even when officially compromised, even when denied, they still had this powerful, irreversible impact across the Atlantic. Okay, so if you thought things were getting messy with those early compromises, well, those were just tremors. The real earthquake was coming. The real test of the revolution's principles happened as internal and external pressures just kept mounting, pushing France towards extremes few probably imagined at the start. A key moment here. The king's flight to Varennes in June 1791. Louis XVI and the family trying to sneak out of Paris in disguise, clearly hoping to, rally support against the revolution, maybe even start a counter-revolution. But he got recognized near the border, forced back to Paris, humiliated.
Yeah, the impact of that escape attempt was huge, especially because the king left behind this letter criticizing the revolution. It just cemented public distrust, made it solid, and it definitely strengthened radical voices hostile to the continued existence of the monarchy. It's really after this that you see significant numbers of people starting to seriously talk about, democratic or Republican government. Marie Antoinette had written back in April 91 that they had to basically pretend to agree with everything until they could act. Captivity proved they weren't acting freely. And that newspaper, Journal des Perles, in June 91, just summed up the feeling of betrayal. How could one ever again have confidence in anything the king might say? And this distrust. It only got worse with the shadow of war looming in 1792. External threats popped up from Prussia and Austria. Remember the Declaration of Pillnitz? That warning they might intervene. That caused real anxiety in France. The Girondists, who were mostly moderate Republicans, they actually pushed for war, maybe hoping to unite the country, spread the revolution. And Louis XVI, surprisingly maybe, went along with it. He probably thought the French army was a mess, would lose quickly, and saw it as his best chance for rescue by foreign powers.
But those early French army defeats, they had massive consequences back home, led to widespread suspicion of treachery, betrayal, and crucially, the rise of the sans-culottes, literally without knee breeches. Referring to the long trousers of working-class Parisians, not the fancy knee breeches of the aristocracy, these were passionate supporters of radical ideas, protesting food shortages, political inaction, and the sans-culottes weren't just talking, they took direct action. June 20, 1792, crowds stormed the legislative Tuileries Palace. Then, August 10th, 1792, 20,000 sans-culottes attacked the Tuileries again. This time, they forced the assembly to suspend the monarchy entirely. This wasn't just about adjusting the constitution anymore, it was about ending the monarchy, period.
Right, and here's a huge shift. The assembly dissolves itself, calls for a new body, the convention. And get this, for the first time, all men in France would be eligible to elect its members, even those who did not own property or pay taxes. This was actual universal male suffrage, a massive step. The U.S. ambassador, Gouverneur Morris, he saw it happening, wrote something like, "The Constitution has this day, I think, given its last groan." The old system was really collapsing, but this period also brings us the horrific September massacres. Early September 1792. Panic, fueled by the Prussian army getting closer, led the sans-culottes to storm the Paris jails. They pulled out over 1,000 prisoners and executed them. They genuinely seemed to believe these prisoners were enemies within, planning an uprising. It was sheer mob justice, born out of fear and paranoia.
And the radical journalist Jean-Paul Marat even publicly called September 3rd for the rest of France to do the same thing, kill political prisoners. Amidst all this chaos, the convention meets on September 22, 1792. First order of business: abolish the monarchy. Declare France a republic. And now, with universal male suffrage, it was, on paper at least, the most democratic nation in the world. So one of the first big questions for this new republic, this convention, was what to do about the former king. Louis XVI was put on trial for treason. The Mountain faction, those were the more radical Jacobins from Paris, led by Maximilien Robespierre, they argued for immediate execution. Robespierre famously said, "Louis must die because the nation must live." But the Girondists, the more moderate group, they argued for a proper hearing, maybe even a public vote, trying to, avoid that final step.
The outcome was pretty stark, though. Louis XVI was found guilty. The vote was overwhelming, 683 to 0, a clear statement. But the death sentence itself, that was much closer, 380 to 310, which really shows the deep divisions even among the revolutionaries about taking such a drastic, irreversible action. He was guillotined on January 21st, 1793. His lawyer, Raymond Desez, had made this famous defense speech back in December 92, arguing Louis wasn't a tyrant but a friend of the people. He said the people wanted liberty. He gave it to them. A last, desperate plea, really, against the revolutionary tide.
And his execution, it absolutely shocked the leaders of other European states.
Yeah.
Spain, Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, they all declared war on France. Internally, it fueled even more rebellion, especially the Catholic and Royal Army in the Vendée region. Their slogan was blunt: "We want our king, our priests, and the old regime." The revolution was now fighting for its very survival, both inside and outside France.
Which brings us to, well, the most extreme period, where those initial principles seemed almost completely lost. This is where the Committee of Public Safety comes in, April 1793. It was created to sort of guide the government through the crisis, but it rapidly gained enormous power, establishing what sources call a totalitarian state, which used terror and fear to subdue its opponents. And the chilling part, they claimed they were doing it all in the name of liberty, equality, and justice. Robespierre became its main voice, its spokesman. Jean-Paul Saint-André, another committee member, said in August 93, "The evil which besets us is that we have no government." They were going to provide one, all right, with absolute power.
Yeah, this committee enacted some serious emergency measures for the suppression of dissent. They brought in the law of the maximum to control food prices, a military draft, the levée en masse, to bolster the army. But the most frightening was the law of suspects. It didn't just limit judicial protections, it basically tore them up. It defined political crimes so broadly. I mean, things like lacking enthusiasm for the revolution could get you arrested. It made it so that, as the sources say, no one felt safe from suspicion. The promise of security, gone, replaced by suspicion. And this period, it just became known as the Terror. Simple as that. The convention literally declared terror is the order of the day. Marie Antoinette, most of the Girondist leaders executed. Estimates vary, but maybe up to 16,000 people sentenced to death by guillotine, up to 500,000 imprisoned. Robespierre gave that famous justification February 5, 1794. Terror is nothing but prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. The government of the revolution is the despotism of liberty against tyranny, a terrifying philosophy.
And to give you a really vivid, awful example of this terror, after Lyon was recaptured from royalist rebels, the committee vowed to destroy the city. They executed about 2,000 people there. An eyewitness in Lyon, January 93, described how the blood of those who had been executed was still running in the streets, and reported hearing a sans-culotte say, just callously, "Why should it be cleared as the blood of aristocrats and rebels? The dogs should lick it up." It just shows this brutal dehumanization that had taken hold. And amidst all this political terror, there was also this radical de-Christianization movement happening, 93 to 94. The convention really wanted to crush the Catholic Church's power. They abandoned the traditional Christian calendar, created a new revolutionary one, took education away from the church, legalized divorce.
Yeah, and local officials often went even further, acting on their own initiative. Closing churches, renaming Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris the Temple of Reason, taking saint off street signs, forcing priests to marry or face deportation. This wasn't just about political power. It was a radical attempt to fundamentally reshape French culture and identity, to replace traditional faith with a kind of civic religion based on reason. It really shows how deep the revolutionary ambition went. Transforming society meant transforming its moral and spiritual core, which, predictably, was incredibly disruptive. But here's an interesting point: the unintended social harm. The government just didn't have the money or infrastructure to replace all the services, hospitals, charities that the church used to run. So this actually led to more suffering and hardship, especially for the poor. Even Robespierre worried about a backlash, France being such a religious country. And while the convention technically declared religious freedom a founding principle, most churches were actually closed by the spring of 1794. Later, Robespierre centralized power even more, letting the committee hire and fire local officials, which was a huge change from the early days of electing local officials back in '89. Another step away from local control. Okay, so let's talk about how this extreme period, the terror, started to wind down and what came next. With France starting to have success in its wars, both the civil wars and against foreign enemies, some of the justifications for the terror began to fade. The sense of immediate existential crisis lessened, maybe just a bit.
Exactly. And public doubt started to grow about the committee's methods. Robespierre's whole campaign to promote this civic religion, the cult of the supreme being, well, it was met with a lot of skepticism. Critics like Jacques Alexis Thoriot supposedly quipped, "It's not enough for him to be master, he has to be God." Which wasn't just about religion. It showed people were getting tired of his level of control. And this period also saw what's called the Great Terror, June-July 1794. A new law broadened the definition of treason even more, things like just inspiring discouragement. It removed the need for witnesses or defense lawyers in trials, stripped away even the pretense of justice. Over 1,500 people were guillotined in Paris during those 2 months alone.
But the fear and the doubt finally reached a tipping point. It led to a backlash within the convention itself. Robespierre was arrested on July 27, 1794, the 9th of Thermidor, in the revolutionary calendar. He, along with most of the committee members, was quickly sent to the guillotine, effectively ending the terror. The revolution, quite literally, devoured its own children, and the period that followed. It's known as the Thermidorian reaction. Policy swung back, became much less radical. Prisoners were released, religious freedom was declared again, which led to this tremendous resurgence of Catholicism across the country. But interestingly, royalist sentiment also started to grow stronger again, people hoping for a return to monarchy. The pendulum was definitely swinging back.
But the instability, oh, it wasn't over yet. You still had shortages and uprisings in 1795. Terrible harvests led to famine, which drove the sans-culottes back into the streets, protesting for bread and demanding a return to more radical policies. There's that stark quote from a protester on May 20th, 1795. "Under Robespierre, blood ran and we had bread. Today, blood does not run and we don't have any bread and we had to make some blood flow to get some." But these protests, they were ultimately put down by the military. This ongoing chaos led to yet another constitution, France's third in 5 years, establishing the Directory in 1795. It notably ended universal male suffrage. Now, voters had to be men who paid taxes or had served in the army. It set up a 2-house legislature and a 5-man executive body, the directors, trying to create something more stable, less prone to radical swings.
But what's really key here is the Directory's increasing reliance on military backing. Royalist uprisings were crushed by the army, often led by this young, ambitious general, Napoleon Bonaparte. Then, in 1797, 3 of the 5 directors actually conspired with the army to void the elections and remove many of the royalists from government. That moment clearly showed, as the source says, that the principle of governing with the consent of the people had fallen by the wayside. The army wasn't just defending the state anymore, it was actively intervening in politics, deciding who got to rule. And this reliance on the military, it paved the way for Napoleon's coup in November 1799. Napoleon was incredibly popular, a hero from France's successful foreign wars. He came back to Paris seeing the political instability. Abbé Sieyès, one of the original revolutionaries but now fearing a return to the terror, actually sought Napoleon's help to create a more authoritarian government. Napoleon saw his chance, used the army to basically disband the legislature, and seized power for himself as first consul. The revolution had, in a way, come full circle from overthrowing a king for liberty to ending up under the rule of a military strongman.
And with that, Napoleon made that powerful and maybe slightly chilling declaration on December 15th, 1799. "Citizens, the revolution is established on the principles with which it began. It is over," signaling an end to all that revolutionary upheaval, but on his terms. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's think about the big picture. What really was the ultimate legacy of this whole journey through the soaring ideals, the deep crisis, the painful compromises?
Well, you absolutely cannot ignore the devastating human cost. Unfortunately, the revolution came at terrible costs in terms of loss of life. We're talking around 250,000 people died in the Civil War inside France alone. And estimates suggest some 5 million died in the European wars during the whole revolutionary and Napoleonic period. It's a stark reminder that the revolution was just as much about power and violence as it was about progressive political ideas.
Yeah, a staggering cost. But balancing against that, you have the enduring ideas, right? Despite all the compromises, all the violence, those core political ideas, equality and rights, freedom of expression, the right to vote, freedom from arbitrary imprisonment, these had a massive, lasting impact across the world. They kept influencing reformers and revolutionaries for centuries, inspiring change way beyond France.
Absolutely. Those fundamental principles that citizens are equal before the law and should have equal opportunity, and critically, that the authority of the state must come from its people. These are direct legacies that are widely accepted today. However messy and violent their birth was, these concepts profoundly reshaped how we think about government, rights, and where power comes from.
Definitely a lot to think about there. So as you reflect on this complex legacy, the incredible ideals, the desperate compromises, the shocking violence, here's a final thought to consider. How much liberty is a society willing, or perhaps forced, to compromise for stability and security, especially in times of deep crisis? And what lessons from this turbulent period in French history might resonate with our world today as societies everywhere continue to navigate political change and crisis?